What would you do if someone's life was slipping away? 30,000 feet above the ground. Today, we relive the terrifying moments when an ordinary flight turned into a race against time. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Your support helps us bring you more real stories from the skies. The flight began like any other. The cabin buzzed with the soft chatter of passengers, the occasional laughter from families seated together, and the clinking of beverage carts making their rounds. Outside the windows, the vast blue stretched endlessly, dotted by slow-moving clouds that looked deceptively peaceful. At 30,000 feet, the world seemed far removed from the chaos of the ground. For most, it was just another flight, another few hours of reading, sleeping, or scrolling through glowing screens. Among the passengers sat a man in his mid-50s, dressed in a crisp shirt and blazer, his appearance hinting at a life of schedules and responsibility. To some, he might have looked like a businessman on a routine trip, or perhaps a father visiting family. He had greeted the flight attendants with polite smiles, accepted his coffee with a quiet thank you, and settled into his seat like someone accustomed to air travel. Nothing about him stood out, nothing suggested that in a short while he would become the center of everyone's attention. The cabin crew moved with their usual practiced grace. For them, this was flight number 3 of the day, another stretch of hours balancing efficiency with warmth. The lead flight attendant had just checked in with the cockpit, confirming that weather ahead looked clear. Pilots too were relaxed, monitoring instruments, exchanging light conversation, and reviewing their expected landing time. Everything was routine, ordinary, and safe. But sometimes, disasters do not announce themselves. They creep in silently, without warning. It began subtly. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pressing a hand against his chest as though trying to ease some invisible weight. At first, it might have looked like heartburn, nothing alarming. But then he sat forward abruptly, his breath coming quicker, shallow, and uneven. His face lost its color, beads of sweat forming at his temple. A woman seated beside him, a stranger traveling alone, noticed the change and instinctively reached for the call button. The familiar chime sounded, and a flight attendant hurried down the aisle, expecting perhaps a spilled drink or a request for water. What she saw instead froze her in place, the man now gasping, clutching his chest with a look of terror spreading across his face. The casual murmur of the cabin shifted into uneasy whispers as passengers nearby began to notice. In an instant, the mood inside the aircraft changed. The hum of routine was gone, replaced by the rising tension of uncertainty. Something was terribly wrong, and everyone knew it. The cabin was no longer the tranquil cocoon it had been just minutes before. The man's breaths came in ragged bursts, his hands still pressed against his chest, his knuckles pale. The flight attendant crouched beside him, her training instantly taking over, though inside she could feel her pulse racing. She asked him his name, whether he could speak, but his voice came out fractured and weak, words lost beneath the wheeze of his failing lungs. "Sir, can you hear me?" "Stay with me," she urged, her voice calm on the surface, though every fiber of her being screamed with urgency. Passengers nearby leaned away, unsure of what to do, their eyes wide with alarm. Some clutched their armrests, others whispered hurried prayers under their breath. The stranger beside him, the woman who had pressed the call button, looked from the man to the attendant with silent desperation, as though pleading for her to fix what was happening. The interphone crackled as the attendant called for support. "Medical emergency, row 14, her voice echoed through the galley. Within seconds, 2 of her colleagues were at her side, one with an oxygen tank, the other carrying the emergency medical kit. The lead attendant's voice was steady as she requested, "We need a doctor on board. Please, if there's any medical professional, come forward immediately." The words cut through the cabin, sharp and unsettling. A ripple of panic spread as heads turned, searching for someone who might hold the key to saving this man. Then, a young man in a casual sweater stood shakily, his hand half raised. "I'm a nurse," he said, voice trembling but firm. Moments later, an older woman also rose, introducing herself as a retired physician. Relief flickered in the flight attendant's eyes, though it was fleeting, because even with help, they were still trapped in a pressurized tube 30,000 feet above the earth. The nurse knelt beside the passenger, quickly checking his pulse, his breath, his eyes. "He's going into cardiac distress," he muttered, half to himself, half to the others. The doctor leaned in, her hands practiced but her expression tight with concern. "We'll need the defibrillator ready," she ordered without hesitation. The flight attendant relayed the command, and within moments, the AED, the automated external defibrillator, was brought from the compartment. Every second felt magnified, stretched thin like glass about to shatter. The man's gasps grew weaker, his chest rising and falling in uneven spurts. The nurse and doctor exchanged a grim look, time was slipping away. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain's calm was fractured by the call from the cabin. "Captain, we have a passenger in critical condition. Possible cardiac arrest." The words pierced the usual hum of instruments. The captain's jaw tightened, his mind instantly shifting into emergency mode. He glanced at his first officer, and without speaking, they both knew what was at stake. Diverting the flight could save the passenger, but at 30,000 feet, every minute to the nearest airport mattered. Back in the cabin, the man's body suddenly stiffened. A horrible silence fell as his chest stopped moving, his eyes staring into nothingness. The retired doctor pressed 2 fingers against his neck, searching desperately. Then, with a grave tone, she said the words no one wanted to hear, "He's lost his pulse." The world seemed to tilt. Passengers gasped, some covering their mouths, others crying out softly. The woman beside him began sobbing, unable to comprehend what was unfolding inches from her. The crew, however, moved with urgent precision. The AED pads were applied to his chest, the machine whirring to life with its cold, clinical voice, analyzing heart rhythm. "Do not touch the patient." Time seemed suspended as everyone waited, breaths held, the only sound the mechanical hum of the device. Then, shock advised. "Clear," shouted the nurse, his hands trembling as he ensured no one touched the man's body. A surge of electricity jolted through the passenger's chest, his body convulsing before collapsing back against the seat. Gasps erupted around the cabin, as though everyone had felt the current pass through their own veins. The doctor leaned forward, checking again. Still nothing. Again, she demanded, and the AED resumed its mechanical countdown. Another shock, another violent jolt. The crew worked feverishly, alternating compressions with breaths, the confined aisle turning into a battlefield against time and fate. The passengers could do nothing but watch, their fear thickening the air like smoke. Some prayed aloud, voices quivering, others clutched hands tightly, seeking comfort in strangers. Children peered over seats, their innocence colliding with the incomprehensible sight of life slipping away before their eyes. The captain's voice came over the PA, calm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a medical emergency on board. Please remain seated and allow the crew to work." His words steadied some, but did little to ease the suffocating tension. Everyone knew the truth, they were suspended in the sky, powerless to land instantly, and this man's fate hung by the thinnest of threads. For 10 endless minutes, the battle raged, compressions, oxygen, shocks. The nurse's arms grew heavy with exhaustion, sweat beading across his forehead, but he did not stop. The doctor's voice cut through the chaos, firm, commanding, refusing to surrender. And then, finally, there was movement. A weak cough, a sudden intake of air. The man's chest rose, fragile but undeniable. "He's back," the doctor whispered, relief flooding her voice. The words spread through the cabin like a wave, gasps turning to murmurs of gratitude, some passengers crying openly, others clapping softly as though afraid to break the fragile spell. The woman beside him clutched his hand, tears streaming down her face, whispering words of encouragement even though he drifted between consciousness and oblivion. The flight attendants exchanged a glance, relief tempered by the knowledge that the danger wasn't over. They had pulled him back, but the battle was far from won. The man lay slumped in his seat, his breathing shallow, each rise and fall of his chest fragile as paper. The oxygen mask hissed softly, delivering life in small, measured streams. Around him, the cabin had not returned to normal, it couldn't. The illusion of safety had cracked, and everyone felt the fragility of their journey pressing down like the weight of the thin atmosphere beyond the fuselage. The nurse wiped sweat from his forehead, glancing at the doctor. She gave a small nod, but her eyes betrayed the uncertainty she carried. They had managed to pull him back, but his heart was a fickle thing now, and the altitude, the stress, could easily betray him again. "We need to land as soon as possible," she murmured. The words weren't a suggestion, they were an order. One of the attendants hurried to the cockpit, relaying the grim message. Inside, the captain listened, his jaw tightening as he traced a finger across the navigation display. The aircraft was midway across an oceanic stretch, the nearest suitable airport still nearly an hour away. He glanced at his first officer, then back at the screens, calculations running like fire through his mind. Fuel reserves, weather conditions, runway lengths, all balanced against one fragile heartbeat in the cabin. "We divert," he said finally, his voice steady. "Coordinate with ATC." His hands moved swiftly across the controls, while his first officer contacted the nearest air traffic center, declaring the emergency. The word "Mayday" carried across the invisible airwaves, reverberating with an authority that cleared airspace ahead like parting seas. Back in the cabin, the passengers felt the subtle shift as the plane banked into a new heading. Some exchanged nervous whispers, others stared out the windows as the endless stretch of clouds shifted beneath them. The announcement came soon after, the captain's calm voice smoothing the edges of fear. "Ladies and gentlemen, for the safety of one of our passengers, we will be diverting to the nearest airport. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from the crew." Calm. The word rang hollow against the backdrop of reality. A young boy asked his mother if the man was going to die. She hushed him, stroking his hair, though her eyes glistened with unspoken dread. 2 rows away, an elderly couple held hands tightly, whispering that they'd never heard an emergency like this in all their years of flying. The man's eyes fluttered open briefly, glazed with confusion. His lips moved, forming words no one could quite understand. The woman beside him leaned close, whispering, "You're okay. You're going to be okay." She wasn't sure if she believed it herself, but she clung to the hope like a lifeline. His fingers twitched in hers, faint but deliberate. The nurse leaned back, exhaustion written in every line of his face. He had been prepared for emergencies before, on the ground, in hospitals, with equipment and backup at his side. But here, inside this sealed vessel of steel and fuel, he felt the crushing weight of isolation. The retired doctor caught his gaze, offering a small, firm nod. "You've done well. Keep him stable. That's all we can do until wheels touch down." Minutes bled into eternity. The crew rotated, checking vitals, adjusting oxygen, keeping his airway clear. The AED remained perched ominously nearby, ready to spark again if his heart betrayed him. Each beep of the portable monitor was a cruel reminder that they walked a razor's edge between life and death. For the passengers, time fractured. Some watched every move with wide, unblinking eyes, unable to look away. Others buried themselves in distraction, headphones pressed tight, books open but unread, as though pretending normalcy could banish the reality unraveling just a few rows away. The captain's voice came again, softer this time, as if speaking directly to every soul on board. "We are 25 minutes from landing. Emergency services will be waiting." His calm was a lifeline, though beneath it, his mind was a storm. He thought of his years of training, the countless hours of simulations where systems failed and engines burned. Yet nothing could fully prepare him for this, an invisible war fought not with machinery but with human fragility. The nurse administered compressions again as the man's breathing faltered. His chest rose weakly, then stilled, forcing the team into action once more. "Stay with us," the nurse urged, his voice breaking through the cabin like a plea to the heavens themselves. The defibrillator charged, its clinical voice repeating its instructions. A shock rippled through his body again, and passengers flinched as though jolted themselves. A murmur of sobs drifted from the rows nearby. Strangers whispered encouragement, prayers in different languages rising together like a single plea. For a moment, the boundaries of culture, nationality, and background dissolved. Everyone was united by the fragile hope that this man would cling to life until they could touch solid ground. And then, a gasp. A shuddering inhale, fragile yet unmistakable. The doctor pressed fingers to his neck and nodded sharply. "He's back," she said again, her voice steadier than before, though her hands trembled with the adrenaline of it all. The relief was palpable. Passengers wept, whispered thanks, some clapping softly again. The woman at his side sobbed openly, whispering his name, her hand never leaving his. The nurse leaned back, eyes closed, silently thanking whatever force had guided them through. But relief was fragile. The doctor leaned close to the crew, her words grave. "We have no guarantees he'll hold until landing. We must be ready for anything." The attendants nodded, their training pushing them past exhaustion. They had become both lifeline and shield, carrying the weight of every heart on board. The plane pressed forward through the sky, its engines steady, its course unwavering. Yet inside, time hung suspended. Every second was both a victory and a threat. Every breath from the man was a fragile promise, one they all prayed would not break before the earth finally welcomed them back. The aircraft descended through layers of thick cloud, its wings trembling slightly in the turbulence. The seatbelt sign glowed overhead, a constant reminder of the fragile line between order and chaos. Passengers sat rigid, buckled tight, eyes darting between the window and the narrow aisle where the struggle for one man's life continued. The nurse and doctor worked with tireless precision, their hands steady even as their hearts pounded. The man's pulse was faint but present, the oxygen mask fogging gently with each strained breath. Yet both professionals knew it could vanish again at any moment. His body was a battlefield, and they were fighting without reinforcements, without proper tools, armed only with knowledge and sheer willpower. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but carrying an undertone that betrayed urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our emergency descent. Please remain seated with your belts fastened. Emergency crews are standing by." The word emergency rang like a bell across the cabin. Mothers clutched their children tighter, travelers whispered quick prayers, some clutching crosses, others pressing their palms together in silent devotion. A businessman, who had earlier grumbled about delays, now stared blankly at the seat in front of him, his mind stripped of complaints, left only with the raw awareness of mortality. As the plane dipped lower, the world outside shifted from endless gray to patches of land breaking through the mist. Fields stretched below like a patchwork quilt, roads carving through them, towns dotted with roofs that gleamed faintly in the morning light. For the passengers, it was a glimpse of salvation, solid ground after endless sky. For the crew, it was a finish line they had to reach before time betrayed them again. In the aisle, an attendant knelt beside the woman holding the man's hand. "Ma'am, we'll be landing shortly. Ambulances will be waiting right outside. Stay calm, you're doing so well." The woman nodded, her face pale, streaked with tears, but her grip never loosened. She whispered into his ear again, words of love, of memory, of all the things she feared might be lost if he slipped away in these final minutes. The doctor glanced at the nurse. "Keep him awake if you can. Talk to him. Don't let him drift." The nurse leaned close, speaking softly but firmly. "Stay with us. We're almost there. Just a little longer." The man's eyelids fluttered, his lips parting slightly, though no words emerged. His body seemed to obey the pull of gravity more than the will to live, but still, he clung on. The cockpit was a storm of activity. The first officer relayed updates to air traffic control, confirming priority clearance, emergency cruise positioned, runways cleared. The captain's hands never left the controls, every movement deliberate. He had landed in storms, on icy runways, in crosswinds strong enough to buffet steel, but this felt different. The weight of a single passenger's life pressed heavier than the machine itself. 10 minutes, the first officer said quietly. The captain nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon where the faint outline of the runway began to emerge through thinning clouds. Back in the cabin, tension coiled tighter. The seatbelt sign chimed again, attendants bracing themselves as the descent steepened. The aircraft trembled, a shudder passing through the fuselage that made hearts leap into throats. Gasps filled the cabin, but the captain's voice quickly followed, just turbulence. We are on course. His calm steadied them, like a lighthouse through a storm. The man's heart monitor beeped unevenly, skipping beats that drew quick glances between doctor and nurse. Stay with us, the nurse urged again, pressing 2 fingers against his carotid artery. The rhythm was erratic, fragile. The AED loomed nearby, ready to jolt him back if the line faltered again. The passengers nearest to them couldn't tear their eyes away, each beep resonating inside their chests as if it were their own heart stuttering. The engines roared louder as the plane cut through lower air. The world outside grew sharper, roads, cars, rivers reflecting the faint morning sun. Passengers craned to see, desperate for any sign that the ordeal was ending. And then, the landing gear dropped with a heavy thud, vibrating through the floor like a promise. They were close. Final approach, the captain announced. His tone was calm, but in the cockpit, sweat traced his temples, his focus absolute. The runway stretched ahead now, a silver strip carved into the earth, growing larger with every passing second. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as the plane sank lower, the ground rushing upward. The nurse kept his hand on the man's chest, counting each shallow rise, refusing to let fear betray his composure. The doctor prepared the AED again, whispering to herself, not now. Hold. Just hold. With a shuddering roar, the wheels kissed the runway, rubber screaming against asphalt. The plane jolted, rattled, then steadied as the captain deployed the reverse thrusters. The aircraft decelerated, passengers thrown forward against their belts, gasps and cries filling the cabin. But beneath it all was relief, a visceral, undeniable sense of we made it. The plane slowed, rolling down the runway until it finally eased to a stop at a remote stand where flashing red and blue lights waited like beacons. Fire trucks, ambulances, and emergency crews lined the tarmac, engines growling, sirens wailing faintly through the sealed cabin walls. The captain's voice came one final time, cabin crew, doors to manual. Emergency medical team is ready. The attendants moved with practiced speed, opening the doors as medics surged up the mobile stairs. Within seconds, paramedics crowded the aisle, voices overlapping as they transferred the man onto a stretcher, monitors clicking, for lines prepared. The woman cried openly now, her hand never leaving his until the very last moment when the medics urged her aside. As the stretcher disappeared down the aisle, the passengers broke into applause, louder this time, fierce and raw. Some wept, some prayed, others simply closed their eyes in gratitude. They weren't clapping for the man alone, but for the nurse, the doctor, the crew, the captain, for every thread of humanity that had held them together through the longest flight of their lives. The captain sat back in his chair, finally allowing his shoulders to slump, his eyes closing briefly in exhausted relief. He had delivered them safely, but in his heart, he knew the journey wasn't truly over until he heard whether the man had survived. On the tarmac, under flashing lights and the rising sun, the battle for one fragile life continued. And inside the cabin, 100 strangers sat in silence, united by what they had witnessed, the fragility of breath, the strength of compassion, and the reminder that at 30,000 feet, humanity was all they truly had. When the wheels finally kissed the runway, it felt like the entire cabin exhaled in unison. The screech of rubber against asphalt was the most beautiful sound many of the passengers had ever heard. Relief poured over them in waves, some whispered prayers of gratitude, others simply closed their eyes, too exhausted to do anything but breathe. For a moment, the world outside seemed distant. Inside the aircraft, it was as though everyone had just survived a storm together. The young woman, the one who had spiraled into panic thousands of feet above the earth, sat slumped in her seat, her chest still rising and falling quickly. But there was a difference now. The trembling had eased, her grip on the armrest loosened, and she could finally lift her gaze without being crushed by fear. She looked at the flight attendant who had stayed by her side, offering steady words when she couldn't find her own. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange was a profound gratitude that words could never fully capture. Across the aisle, a man who had barely acknowledged strangers at the start of the flight leaned over and asked softly, "Are you okay now?" She managed a weak nod, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. Something about the shared ordeal had stripped away the invisible walls between people who otherwise would have remained anonymous to one another. They weren't just passengers anymore, they were witnesses to each other's vulnerability, survivors of a small but deeply human crisis in the sky. In the cockpit, the pilots exchanged a different kind of glance. Their job had been to deliver everyone safely, and they had done just that, but they also knew the fragility that came with being responsible for lives, not only in mechanical terms but in the human stories unfolding behind the cockpit door. An engine warning, a turbulence report, a diversion, they trained endlessly for these scenarios. But what about the invisible battles passengers carried with them? What about the weight of fear, trauma, or panic? There were no checklists for those, only empathy and patience. As the cabin doors opened and passengers began to shuffle out, the young woman hesitated. For a moment, she lingered by the exit, watching the faces of those who had silently supported her, some with quiet smiles, others with nothing more than a reassuring nod when she thought she was being swallowed by her fear. Then she stepped forward, her legs unsteady but determined, and walked into the terminal. The ground beneath her feet felt different, almost sacred, because she had touched the edge of her breaking point and made it through. What had happened up there was more than a panic attack. It was a reminder of how fragile human beings can be when placed in environments far beyond their control. Yet it was also a reminder of resilience, how even in the tight confines of a pressurized cabin, people could come together, if only for a fleeting moment, to remind one another that they weren't alone. The flight attendant, gathering her things after the last passenger had disembarked, allowed herself a tired smile. She knew this wasn't the first time she had seen someone break down in fear midair, and it wouldn't be the last. But she also knew that for that young woman, the memory of this flight would carry a lesson, that fear can feel all-consuming, but it doesn't have to define the journey. Sometimes, survival is not about fighting the storm outside but facing the storm within. And so, as the plane prepared to be cleaned and readied for its next flight, life moved on. But for those who had lived through those long, tense hours above the clouds, the memory would linger, a story of fear, connection, and the quiet strength it takes to endure. Because sometimes, the most powerful journeys don't end when the plane lands. They live on in the people who walked off it, forever changed.